Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was halfway through my 2-week rotation when the world started to fall apart. My name is Daniel Price. I am a seasonal fire lookout with the United States Forest Service, posted on a wooden tower above the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest in Washington State. The tower sits on a ridgeline a few miles off a rough dirt road, 40 feet in the air on timber legs, with a wraparound deck and a small cabin on top that doubles as my office, bedroom, and kitchen. From up there I can see the valley floor, the Columbia River in the distance on a clear day, and a handful of small towns whose lights used to flicker at night. My job is simple on paper: scan for smoke, log weather, report lightning, and call in anything that looks like it wants to turn into a wildfire. The tower has no running water. I keep plastic jugs, a gravity filter, and a couple of blue 5-gallon containers that I refill when the patrol truck brings up supplies. Power comes from a pair of solar panels bolted to the roof, wired to a deep-cycle battery bank that runs my small LED lights, a portable fridge, a laptop, and, most importantly, the radios. I cook on a small propane stove. I sleep on a narrow bunk along the wall, with the Osborne firefinder in the center of the room on its stand like an old piece of artillery. I always liked the simplicity of it: circles, azimuths, and landmarks. The first sign that something was different came 3 days into my shift. It was mid-afternoon. The sky was clear, humidity low, wind light from the east. I had done the noon weather observation, keyed it into the radio, and was working through the logbook when I saw a smoke column on the horizon that did not fit anything on my map. At first, I thought it was a prescribed burnout of my district, but the shape was wrong. It was a dark, tight column near the edge of town, not the wide, controlled drift you see from a planned operation. I stepped out onto the catwalk with my binoculars and leaned against the rail. The smoke was coming from near the little town to the southeast, one of those places that lives on tourists, gas stations, and a grocery store. No lightning had passed through that area in the last week. No one had called in any burns. It looked like something in town was burning hard and fast. I marked the bearing on the firefinder, gave the coordinates to dispatch, and waited for the usual back and forth. Instead, the response from the main repeater came back clipped and short. "Copy column near town," the dispatcher said. "We see it on satellite. Units already notified." The voice sounded distracted. In the background, I could hear another dispatcher talking over someone, then some high-pitched beeping from a console. It sounded more like an emergency operations center than a quiet late-season fire day. "Everything all right down there?" I asked. A long pause answered me. Then, "We're busy, Price. Keep us updated on any new starts. If you see more columns, call them in. Stand by on this one." The radio clicked off. I stood on the catwalk for a long time, watching the column build and then turn into a broad brown smear over the town. It looked like a commercial block or a fuel depot burning, something with a lot of material. Even from the tower I could see flashes, probably transformers popping as power lines failed. An hour later, a second column started on the far side of town, then a third. After that, the entire area became one diffuse haze. That night, I heard sirens drifting faintly up the canyon. The glow from the valley was unusually bright, not just one fire but scattered points of orange. The wind carried the smell of burned plastic and something else I could not identify. I wrote it all down in the log, because that was what I knew how to do. The next morning, the routine changed again. I turned on my handheld VHF radio as usual to check in with dispatch and got only partial words. The main repeater was busy with traffic from other units, voices stepping on each other. I heard fragments: patient, unresponsive, multiple, copy, all units hold, negative, do not approach. Then the dispatcher called for radio discipline, asked everyone to clear the air for priority medical channels. I switched to the National Interagency Fire channel to see if it was just local chaos. Instead, I heard a different voice, calm but strained, reading what sounded like an emergency message. Due to ongoing public health incidents and large-scale civil disturbances, all non-essential operations are suspended. Field personnel are advised to shelter in place if safe to do so. Avoid contact with individuals exhibiting aggressive confusion, biting, or uncoordinated movement. Use law enforcement channels for security-related requests. I listened twice before it sank in. This was not a local wildfire. It was not even only our area. They were using phrases that sounded like someone had cut a hospital manual and pasted it into an emergency broadcast. Over the next few hours, the calls turned messier. Ranger units tried to reach law enforcement for coordination on evacuations. Some got no answer. One sheriff's deputy came up on the air, voice shaking, talking about people crowding roadblocks and pushing through vehicles. A medic unit reported being surrounded while trying to load a patient, then cut off mid-sentence. Every so often, the dispatcher would repeat the same instruction. If you are not engaged in life safety, shelter in place. Do not attempt to enter population centers. Use caution with any unknown person. I stood beside the radio shelf, logbook open, pencil idle. My tower was 3 hours out on a rough forest road at the best of times. I had enough food for 3 weeks if I rationed, more if I stretched. Water was my main limit, but I could draw from the rain barrels and small spring a short hike down slope. I had a government truck parked below, an aging white pickup with a light bar and the agency logo on the doors. It might as well have been on another planet. The idea of driving down into whatever was happening in town felt reckless. By late afternoon, the repeaters started to fall silent between bursts. Then there were no more coherent units checking in, just random calls. A voice shouting for help. Another voice on the same channel crying. Someone repeating a street name over and over. The dispatcher tried to get control, asked for unit identifiers, then finally said, "All field personnel who can hear this is Central. We are going to back up power only. If you are in a safe location with supplies, remain there. If you are near the station, come to the station. Law enforcement has advised avoiding highways near urban centers. Keep radios on low power and preserve batteries. Central out." The carrier dropped. The room felt smaller. I turned the volume down and let the radio sit. Outside, the forest was quiet. The wind was light. A hawk circled above the ridge like it always did in the afternoons. Nothing in my immediate world had changed at all, but down in the valley something was burning and people were calling for help on every channel that still worked. That night, I tried to pick up AM and FM stations on my small portable radio. Many frequencies were dead. A few carried interrupted emergency tones and then recorded messages talking about a widespread infection event, advising people to stay inside, avoid direct contact with anyone acting violently, and wait for instructions. The words sounded polished and calm, but in between the recordings I could hear live voices arguing in the background, phones ringing, doors opening and closing. On one station out of Seattle, someone broke in mid-message and started talking fast, saying that the hospital was full of people with bites and that no one seemed to know how it had started. The station cut to static and never came back. I did not sleep much that night. I left the windows cracked so I could hear anything that sounded unusual. All I got was wind in the guy wires, the creak of the tower legs as the temperature dropped, and the occasional distant pop from what might have been transformers along the power lines in the valley. At some point after midnight, the lights in town went dark and did not come back. The next morning, I made a decision. I called Central on the VHF repeater. No answer. I tried several times, switching between our main channel and the backup. Nothing. I could still hit the repeater. The courtesy beep came back, but no one on the other end was replying. If no one was going to tell me what to do, I would treat this like any other incident. Inventory, assess, plan. I sat on the bunk with my notebook and wrote out what I had. Food, 2 weeks of canned goods, rice, pasta, some freeze-dried meals and snack bars. Water, 1 full blue container, a half-full one, and what was left in the rain barrels, maybe 20 gallons total. Fuel, 3 full propane cylinders, half a tank of gas in the truck, a 5-gallon jerry can in the storage locker, power, 2 good solar panels, batteries at full charge, tools, a Pulaski, a shovel, a chainsaw, a small toolkit, and my personal gear. Communication, tower radio, handheld VHF, AM/FM/NOAA receiver. Then there was the part we were not supposed to rely on, but everyone did anyway. In my duffel, I had my personal handgun, a 9mm pistol with 3 magazines. In the truck, under a blanket in the back seat, I had a lever-action .30, .30 rifle I used in the fall when I camped out after the season. Officially, they were not part of the standard equipment list. Practically, a lot of us who worked alone in the forest carried something. I laid everything out in my mind and circled the weak points. Water and information were the biggest ones. I opened the small cabinet where we keep old reports and found a photocopy of an emergency shelter-in-place guideline. It covered severe weather, wildfires blocking exit routes, and civil unrest. The advice was almost always the same. Stay put, harden your location, signal for help, and do not move unless you have verified that the route is safe. That last part was impossible right now. I had no way to verify anything beyond what I could see through glass. For the next 2 days, nothing happened directly to me. The forest remained the forest. The radio stayed mostly quiet. A few times, I thought I heard voices on the National Law Enforcement channel, but they were faint and full of static. I focused on small tasks, topping off water containers, reorganizing food so I knew exactly what I had, cleaning the solar panel connections and tightening bolts on the tower legs. At night, the valley stayed dark. No street lights, no house lights, no vehicle headlights on the highway, only the occasional glow of what looked like unattended fires. A structure burning out, a gas station flare. The air smelled heavier every day, the smoke settling into the low ground like a blanket. On the 5th day, I saw people. It was late morning. The sun had burned through the haze a little, giving me a clearer view down canyon. I swung the binoculars along the old forest road that snaked up toward the tower. It was something I did out of habit, making sure no campers or unauthorized off-roaders were making their way up. Usually the road was empty. This time, there was a group of figures moving along the switchbacks. At first, I thought it was a rescue crew, or maybe a family trying to get to higher ground. There were 8 or 9 of them, spread out across the road in a loose cluster. They walked slowly, some with a slight limp. None of them wore bright jackets or backpacks. No one carried gear the way hikers do. They moved like people just out for a walk, except their paths did not line up with the logic of the terrain. One would drift off into the brush, then turn back to the road for no reason. Another would stand still for a long time, then hurry to catch up. I tried the handheld radio on the Forest Road channel. Any unit on Road 12, this is Tower 7. I see pedestrians on the access road. Do you copy? Static answered. I tried again. Nothing. I watched the figures with the binoculars as they made their way up. Something about them bothered me. Even from that distance, I could tell that their clothes were dirty and torn, like they had been out there longer than a day hike. They did not look around much. They kept their heads level, no scanning or pointing. Nobody talked. When they stopped near one of the old turnout spots, I noticed another detail. None of them carried visible water bottles. If they were lost campers, they were very unlucky. If they were something else, I needed to know before they reached tower. I grabbed the rifle from the truck, checked that it was loaded, and carried it up the stairs with me. I did not want to use it on anything but a cougar or a bear, but the way the week was going, I stopped worrying about what was normal. I waited on the catwalk, the rifle propped against the wall, the binoculars pressed to my face. The group moved slowly, sometimes stopping for several minutes, then lurching forward again. They did not appear to be following the road with a clear goal. They simply drifted in its general direction, drawn by something I could not see. As they got closer, I began to hear them. Not voices, exactly. Every so often, one of them would emit a short sound, like a low grunt or a breath forced through clenched teeth. They never called out to each other. When one stumbled and fell, the others kept moving until the fallen figure got up and resumed. By early afternoon, they were within half a mile of the tower. The access road dead ends near the base of the ridge, turning into a narrow track that climbs the last slope up to the tower. If they kept following the road, they would eventually find the trail, and from there, if they were determined, the tower itself. I stood there, radio in hand, wanting someone to tell me what protocol covered this. The laminated guidelines did not mention groups of silent people wandering up a remote forest road during a national emergency broadcast about an infection. A small sound broke the air, a rock rolling. I flinched and turned. It came from below. I stepped to the edge of the catwalk and looked down. The truck sat in its little flat clearing, doors closed, white paint dusted with ash. Beyond it, the trail dropped into the trees. Everything looked normal. No one was there. The sound came again, this time from the slope on the far side of the tower. A stone slid down, tapped against another, then bounced. I leaned over and saw nothing but the steep drop, littered with dead branches and loose rock. The forest was playing tricks on my nerves. I forced myself to breathe slower. The group on the road disappeared into a stand of trees. I tried to track them and lost them behind a ridge. When they did not reappear, I assumed they had turned off or simply sat down somewhere out of sight. The anxiety did not leave with them. They had put an image in my head. People moving through the forest without clear purpose, drawn by who knew what. I realized that if anyone did climb up here, the tower was not as secure as it looked. The stairs from ground to deck were open, treated lumber with cross braces. Anyone with 2 good legs could climb them. The door at the top had a deadbolt and a simple metal latch, but the walls of the cabin were just wood and glass. That evening, I took action. I hauled up my small toolkit, selected a wrench, and unbolted the bottom 2 sections of stairs. It took time and a lot of effort, the lumber stubborn from years of weathering. By the time I was done, the first 8 feet of stairs were gone. The remaining steps started above my head. I rigged a rope ladder from spare rope and a few short lengths of board, enough to climb down in a controlled way if I really needed to, and pulled it up once I was back on the deck. Standing at the edge, looking down at the gap, felt both better and worse. I had isolated myself. I had also cut off my easiest escape route. Days passed. The group on the road did not return, at least not where I could see them. The valley remained mostly quiet. My food stocks shrank. I rationed carefully, 1 real meal a day, small snacks otherwise. My water use dropped. I bathed with a damp cloth instead of a proper wash. Routines kept me from thinking too much about the silence on the radio. Sometimes at night I heard faint noises carried up from the forest. A branch breaking. A short, abrupt shout that did not sound like an animal. Once, the high, distinct crack of a firearm far in the distance. Every time I heard something, I moved to the window with the rifle, heart beating fast, and saw only treetops. On the 9th day, the law enforcement channel came to life for a few minutes. A voice identified itself as a state trooper, calling any unit near the highway, asking about a blocked overpass. No one answered. He tried again. Then I heard something in the background, a pounding sound, followed by muffled yelling. The trooper's voice cut off mid-word. The carrier stayed open for a few seconds, broadcasting only static and distant thudding, then dropped. I turned the volume all the way down. Listening was not helping. By the end of the second week, the idea that someone was going to come up the road and tell me it was over started to fade. My 2-week rotation date came and went with no replacement ranger. No call from the district office asking why I was not at the station. The world below had stopped caring about my schedule. It was when I began to treat the tower as a long-term shelter instead of a temporary post. I consolidated supplies inside. I moved the propane cylinders to the corner and secured them so they would not tip if the tower swayed. I brought the chainsaw up and set it by the door, chain sharpened and bar oil topped off, in case I needed it for more than cutting logs. I checked the battery bank daily, watching the voltage, trying to decide how much power I needed to save for communication versus light. I also started carrying the pistol on my belt at all times. It felt foolish at first, like an overreaction, but every time I walked out onto the catwalk and saw the empty sky in every direction, I remembered how quickly the voices on the radio had disappeared. The infected did not reach me for several more days. When they did not come with screams or any dramatic sound. They came almost like wildlife, quiet, persistent, and drawn to patterns I did not immediately understand. It was late afternoon, gray with high smoke. I was making coffee on the propane stove when I heard a scuff against one of the tower legs. It was a distinct sound, different from wind or branches. Wood against something soft, then a small grunt. I turned the stove off, grabbed the rifle, and moved to the nearest window. The angle there showed me only the top few feet of each supporting leg and the deck below the catwalk. Nothing. Another noise came, this time directly under the floor. Something brushed the underside, followed by a slow shuffling sound. I stepped back, then went out onto the catwalk, rifle held low but ready. I moved to the side of the tower that overlooked the slope and looked straight down. 3 people stood at the base of the structure, among the weeds and low shrubs. Their faces were turned up, necks bent at uncomfortable angles, as if the idea of looking up was new to them. All 3 wore street clothes, jeans, t-shirts, a stained hoodie. One of them had a shoe missing. Their skin looked pale under a layer of dirt and ash. They stared at me without speaking. From my vantage point, I could see small details. Dried streaks on their clothes that might have been from falls, not from anything I wanted to think about too hard. Fingers curled in a strange half-claw, not quite relaxed and not quite ready to grab anything. Their breathing looked shallow and fast, chests rising and falling at irregular intervals. "Hello," I called out before I could stop myself. My voice sounded too loud. They reacted to the sound. All 3 jerked their heads slightly in my direction. Their eyes focused, not like animals, but not entirely like healthy people either. Their gaze seemed to lag behind their head movement. "Are you all right?" I asked. "Do you need help?" The person in the hoodie took a step forward until they bumped against one of the tower legs. Their shoulder hit the wood and they paused, as if surprised by the resistance. Then they began to push, slow but steady, their hands finding the post, fingers sliding along it. The other two joined, not in a coordinated way, but drawn to the contact. Soon, all three were pressing against the same leg, palms flat. They did not look up anymore. They just pushed, as if they could somehow move the entire structure by leaning into it. The tower creaked slightly, but did not shift. The legs are sunk deep into the ground with concrete anchors. A few people pushing were not going to knock it over. Still, the sight of them standing there, silent, pressing their bodies against the support beam, did something unpleasant in my stomach. "I cannot help you," I called down. "You need to go back to town." No reaction. They continued pushing, pausing only to adjust their stance when their feet slipped on the loose soil. I thought about trying the radio again, calling anyone, but I knew what I would hear. Nothing. Out here, I was the only one watching this. Hours later, they were still down there. The light faded. The forest shifted into its nighttime version. The three figures remained at the base of the tower, occasionally moving from one leg to another, sometimes wandering a few feet away and then returning to touch the wood. They made quiet sounds now and then, throaty noises without clear words. Whenever I walked across the floor, they seemed to react, moving directly beneath where I was. It reminded me of animals following footsteps they could not see, tracking vibration. I did not sleep that night. I lay on the bunk with the pistol within easy reach and listened to the small sounds from below. Footsteps in dry grass, hands brushing against timber, a faint thump as someone bumped their shoulder against the support beams. They never called out. They never tried to speak in any way I recognized. By morning, there were 6 of them. The newcomers had arrived sometime before dawn. When I stepped out onto the catwalk, pale light touching the treetops, I saw 3 more figures around the tower legs. One leaned against a beam as if resting, eyes half closed but body upright. Another paced in a small circle, repeating the same path between 2 rocks. The third stood still with head tilted, listening. It felt like a slow leak of people from a broken world, pooling at the one vertical object in their path. For 2 days, the group grew. Single figures would emerge from the trees, drawn by some combination of sound, scent, or simply the shape of the tower against the sky. Most arrived silently, walking with that same off-balance gait. A few came faster, stumbling and then catching themselves. All of them ended up at the base of the structure, touching the legs, looking up when I stepped onto the catwalk, then focusing on the wood again. By the evening of the second day, I counted 11. If they had been mindless, I might have felt a different kind of fear. As it was, they did not act completely without thought. They reacted to my movement. They oriented toward sounds. Once, when a bird flew low overhead and called out, several of them looked up at the same moment, as if the noise had triggered something. There was something moving behind their eyes, but it did not look like the kind of awareness you wanted in neighbors. I rationed my visibility. I moved slowly inside the cabin, trying to keep noise to a minimum. The less I triggered them, the calmer they seemed. When I had to go onto the catwalk to adjust something on the solar panels, they gathered more tightly around the leg closest to me, hands brushing the beam. It was like living above a pen of quiet, restless animals that had once been people. On the 3rd day of this, something changed. I was making a weather observation, force of habit, pointless now but comforting, when I heard a new sound. The sharp scraping of something against wood in a vertical pattern, like nails dragging along a board. It came from below, then stopped, then started again, higher. I moved to the nearest window and looked down. One of the infected, a tall man in a gray t-shirt, had found the supports that braced the tower between the legs. He had climbed onto a low cross brace and was now using the diagonal beams as handholds, pulling himself upward. His movements were jerky and imprecise, but they followed a clear goal: up. He did not look at his hands as he climbed. He stared at the timber above him, eyes unfocused, mouth slightly open. When his foot slipped, he scrambled until it found a new spot, then resumed. His fingers left streaks of dirt on the wood. The others watched. They did not try to stop him. They simply oriented toward the movement, necks craning, heads turning as he climbed. My first reaction was disbelief. The tower was not a ladder, but it was climbable if you had basic coordination and enough motivation. The infected man did not have the first, but he clearly had the second. Step by slow step, he ascended the cross braces, sliding sideways when he hit a dead end until he found another angle. He was not climbing efficiently, but he was climbing. I grabbed the rifle and stepped onto the catwalk, heart hammering. The man was already halfway up the structure, maybe 20 feet off the ground. If he kept going, he would reach the underside of the deck. From there, it would be only a short pull to the edge. "Stop," I said out loud, knowing it was pointless. The man did not stop. He hooked an elbow over a horizontal brace and hauled himself up another foot. I weighed my options in a rush. The rifle would solve the immediate problem, but a gunshot would echo through the forest and draw who knew how many more of them. The handgun would be no quieter. The chainsaw would be loud in a different way. Doing nothing was not acceptable. I did not want even one of them on my level. In the end, the decision was simple. I could not let him reach the deck. Whatever noise I made, I would deal with later. I took a position at the catwalk rail, braced the rifle, and aimed down. The angle was awkward. He was close to the tower, his body partly shielded by beams. I picked the largest target I could see, his shoulder. I squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked loud in the still air. Birds exploded from nearby trees, wings beating in panic. The recoil pressed into my shoulder. Below, the man jerked, his body twisting. His grip loosened and he fell backward off the brace, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. For a moment, everything was motion. The other infected scrambled around him, not in concern but in reaction to the impact. Some reached out and touched him. One knelt, hands patting his chest. He did not get up. I stepped back from the rail, pulse racing. The echo of the shot rolled away down the canyon. Within minutes, more figures appeared between the trees. They came from all directions, converging on the base of the tower. Some moved slowly, others in short bursts as if their bodies could not decide on a speed. All were drawn to the sound they had heard and the disturbance at the center of it. The group around the fallen climber swelled from 12 to 20 or more. Soon, there were too many to count accurately from my angle. They formed a ring around the tower legs, pressing in until some were almost directly beneath the deck. They looked up more often now, eyes scanning the catwalk. When I shifted my weight, I could see heads turning in response. Oh, I had bought myself time by knocking one climber down. I had also advertised my position to a wider area. The rest of that day felt like standing on a small island while the tide rose steadily. The infected did not try to climb again right away, but they did not leave. They roamed within a small radius, keeping at least one hand or shoulder against the wood whenever they could. It was as if the tower had become an anchor in their malfunctioning sense of direction. That night, they made more sounds. Short bursts of what might once have been words, now reduced to syllables. Groans forced out of lungs that did not rest. They did not shout. They did not cry. They simply existed, breathing and moving and occasionally bumping into each other. The tower transmitted their movement up into the cabin. Every contact with the legs sent a faint vibration through the structure. Sleep came in brief bits. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the gray t-shirt climbing. I saw his hands finding holds, his blank stare, the way the other infected had watched him. There had been purpose in that climb. Whatever was wrong with their brains, it had not taken away the ability to learn from the environment. On the second day after the shooting, one of them tried again. This time, it was a woman in a dark jacket. She started at the same leg, feeling the cross braces with the awkward hands. Her initial attempts were clumsy. She slipped twice. On the third try, her foot found the same brace the previous climber had used. Her body followed the path almost exactly, as if she had watched and was now repeating something half-remembered. I did not wait until she was halfway up. I took the rifle, aimed carefully, and shot the brace itself a foot above her hands. The wood splintered. The sound boomed again. The brace shook, and she lost her grip, falling back into the crowd. They parted slightly to accommodate her and then closed in again. I looked at the damaged brace and swore under my breath. I had weakened one of the structural elements of my own shelter. It still held, but I had carved a notch into my support system. There were only so many beams I could afford to destroy before the tower integrity became a real problem. Another day, another attempt. They learned faster than I wanted to admit. More of them were now touching the cross braces, fingers feeling for patterns. It was as if the first climber's attempt had unlocked something. Vertical movement as a possibility. I changed tactics. Instead of shooting at them, I waited until most of the group was in the shadow of the tower, then threw down a metal pot far from the legs. It hit a rock and clanged loudly. Every infected head snapped toward the sound. The group moved as one, flowing toward the pot's resting place. It felt like directing a herd. Once they were away from the legs, I lowered the chainsaw on a rope to the closest brace, started it, and cut through the wood as quickly as I could, sending sawdust into the air. The sound was deafening. I could barely hear my own thoughts. The infected rushed back toward the tower, but I'd already finished the cut. The brace dropped, landing with a thud. By the time I turned the saw off and hauled it back up, the infected were at the legs again, hands brushing, bodies pressing against the remaining beams. I had removed one more path upward, but at the cost of more noise. That night, the forest answered the sounds I had made. I was sitting at the small table, studying my remaining food, when a new noise cut through the background. It was low and rhythmic, heavier than the shuffling of the infected. Something large was moving through the undergrowth below, brushing aside branches, snapping small saplings. The infected reacted. They pulled away from the tower legs and oriented toward the sound, bodies turning as one. I grabbed the rifle and stepped onto the catwalk. The air smelled like smoke and old pine needles. The sky was a dark gray sheet. A black bear emerged from the trees, drawn by the scent of humans or food, or simply curiosity about all the movement. It was a big one, shoulders rolling as it walked. It stopped a short distance from the tower, head lifting to test the air. For a moment, the scene held. The bear, the ring of infected, the wooden legs of the tower rising above them all. Then everything broke open. The infected surged toward the bear, not with coordinated intent, but with a kind of unfocused drive. They reached, hands extended. The bear snapped its jaws, swiped with a paw, and knocked two of them aside. They fell, then got up again, staggering, hands still reaching. The bear bellowed and swatted again. It was powerful, it was fast, it still looked outnumbered. I stepped back into the cabin and closed the door, more to shut out the sound than for any real safety. The commotion below became a confused mixture of growls and hoarse human noises. The tower shook lightly as bodies bumped into the legs in all directions. Eventually, the noise faded. I went back onto the catwalk and looked down. The bear was gone, vanished back into the forest. The infected ring was thinner. Some lay on the ground and did not move. Others staggered back to the legs, resuming their slow orbit. I did not try to count how many had not gotten up. I realized something then. Whatever this infection was, it did not only concern people. It was interacting with the rest of the ecosystem in real time. Animals would test the edges of this strange new behavior, and sometimes they would lose. Sometimes they would win. Either way, the forest I knew would not stay the same. Days blurred. I lost track of dates, measuring time only by the status of my supplies and the changing pattern of smoke on the horizon. Once in a while, I tried the radio again. Sometimes I heard brief bursts of life, a military-sounding voice instructing all remaining units to fall back to a certain highway, a fragment of a broadcast about quarantine zones, a civilian voice begging for any aircraft to land at a small airstrip. None of it was sustained. The channels felt like a graveyard of broken conversations. One late afternoon, when the light turned a sickly yellow, I heard the drone of an engine overhead. Not the distant rumble of a jet, but the closer, smaller thrum of a helicopter. I stepped out, hands already lifting the bright orange signal panel we kept for exactly that purpose. The helicopter appeared from the west, flying low along the ridgeline, a dark silhouette against the haze. It was not a firefighting aircraft. There was no external bucket, no markings I could see. It looked more like a military or law enforcement machine. Doors closed, no one leaning out. I waved the panel and a small mirror, angling reflections toward the cockpit. The helicopter continued along its path, unchanging. It flew past the tower, its rotor wash making the treetops sway slightly. For a moment I thought it might circle back. Instead, it kept going, following the ridge toward deeper wilderness. Maybe they were heading for a larger base. Maybe they were running away from the same thing I was looking at below. Either way, they had not come for me. Night followed, and with it a new pattern of sound from the forest. Less motion under the tower, more distant noises. The infected presence ebbed and flowed now, groups arriving and leaving. They seemed to be following something beyond my observation, migrating along old roads and game trails drawn by events I could not see. My food reached a point I could not ignore. I had enough to last another week at strict rations, maybe 2 if I was willing to stretch hunger. Water remained adequate thanks to a few light rains and my careful use, but I knew that would not last forever. Winter would come. Snow would make the road harder to navigate. Some part of me still believed that organized help might arrive before then, but I could not plan on it. The idea of staying forever in a wooden box above a changing world began to feel less like safety and more like a slow trap. I started to think about leaving. The map on the wall offered options. To the north, a deep drainage leading toward another ranger station. To the west, high ground and eventually a paved road, if it was still passable. To the east, the valley with its towns and whatever remained of their people. None of the choices were good. All of them required me to descend from the tower and cross ground I had avoided for weeks. If I was going to go, I would need a clear window and a plan for the first 24 hours. With my limited information, that meant listening more, not less. I turned the radio back up for longer intervals, scanning more channels. On one of the federal emergency frequencies, I finally caught something sustained. Repeat. Safe corridor established along the eastern side of the river between mile marker 63 and mile marker 71, a voice said. Checkpoint operating at the old way station. Limited capacity, screening for symptoms. All individuals must approach on foot, unarmed, hands visible. The signal was weak and full of static, fading in and out. It sounded like a recording looped on automatic playback. The river, they mentioned, could be the Columbia. The mile markers fit the highway down in the valley. 7 or 8 miles of safe corridor did not sound like much, but it was more than I had heard so far. The mention of screening for symptoms suggested that at least some authority still believed they could control this. The way station they referred to was roughly 20 miles from my tower by road. By ridgeline and game trails, it might be less. Still, it was at least a full day's hike, maybe more, through terrain with unknown levels of infected presence. I went back and forth in my head for 2 days. During that time, the number of infected under the tower decreased noticeably. Where once there had been a constant ring, now only 3 or 4 lingered. The others had drifted away in 1s and 2s, following paths through the brush like animals tracking a scent. Whatever had initially drawn them to the tower now competed with other signals. On the afternoon of the second day, the decision came to me not in a moment of clarity, but in a quiet recognition. If I waited any longer, my fear would make the choice for me, and I would die up here when the food ran out. I picked the next morning for departure. That night, I packed. I laid out my gear carefully. Backpack with bare essentials. Food for 3 days, water containers, small stove, first aid kit, extra socks, light sleeping bag, and a tarp. Rifle slung across my chest, pistol at my hip. A spare radio with fully charged batteries, a small AM/FM receiver, a map and compass. I left behind anything that did not directly increase my chances of reaching the supposed safe corridor. Extra clothes, sentimental items, and the heavier tools. Before I slept, I wrote in the logbook, rotation ended. No relief. Communication intermittent. Significant public health incident in progress. Shelter in place no longer viable due to supply limits. Departing tower at first light for attempt to reach established corridor along river. If anyone reads this and I did not return, the tower held longer than most places. It can hold again. I did not know who I was writing for. It felt right anyway. Dawn came gray and cold. A thin layer of frost crusted the rail, hinting at the coming winter. I checked the ground beneath the tower from every angle. Only 2 infected remained, both moving slowly, like the initial drive that had pushed them here was fading. I lowered my rope ladder, heart pounding at the sound of the rungs bumping the wood. The 2 infected reacted, turning their heads, seeking the source. I waited, breath held, until they lost the immediate focus and returned to their aimless orbit. Rifle ready, pack on, I descended. The first step onto the ladder felt like stepping off a cliff. The air was cold on my face. The wood under my hands was solid and real. My boots met the ground with a thump that sounded much louder than it had any right to. The 2 infected turned, finally seeing me on their level. They approached, arms extending, fingers crooked. I backed toward the trailhead, keeping the rifle pointed at them. "Stay back," I said, even though I knew they would not understand. They kept coming. Their gait was slow but determined. I had space and distance. I could move around them and head for the trees. Shooting would slow me, and I had already proved that gunfire was a beacon. I sidestepped through the brush, moving uphill and then along the slope, skirting their reach. They turned to follow, but their reaction lagged. By the time they oriented on my new position, I was already past them, jogging toward the deeper forest. I did not look back at the tower until I reached the first stand of trees. When I did, it looked smaller than I remembered, a fragile shape against the sky, legs rooted in a sea of motionless figures that had once been my only company. I turned away and started down the ridge. compass set toward the river and its promised corridor. The forest closed around me, sounds of my own movement replacing the constant vibration of the tower. Every snapped twig made me flinch. Every unusual shadow looked like a person standing just beyond my vision. I moved carefully, listening as much as watching, blending every outdoor skill I had ever learned with a new set of rules the last 2 weeks had written in hard lines. I was no longer a fire lookout watching for columns of smoke. I was a single person moving through a landscape where silence meant survival, and every sound might draw the wrong kind of attention. Behind me, the tower stood where it had always stood, high above the trees. It had given me extra weeks of life and a long, clear view of the world's unraveling. Now, it was just another landmark in a forest that belonged less and less to the people who had built it. Whatever waited along the river and its alleged safe corridor, I would face it knowing one thing very clearly. The first days of this outbreak had taught me that height and distance were only temporary advantages. Sooner or later, everything tried to climb. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.